Velina, and I'm Kealoha. Today's lecture, we'll be looking at so called political myths or mythologies, especially to understand the role it plays in so called modern contemporary issues of a society. In other words, to understand Hawaiian modern so called issues, we really got to understand mythology, political mythology specifically, and its relationship to what we understand as being so called history. So let's start off by understanding what role political myths have in shaping the way we think, in shaping the way we see so called reality. Now, under the framework of famous Kenyan literary critic Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who in his famous book Decolonizing the Mind comes up with what he calls the cultural bomb. And a cultural bomb is a good way to kind of understand why, in fact, for many so-called native and specifically native Hawaiians, this lack of understanding of who we are plays directly into the issues over modern issues, and specifically as we get into Hawaii. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o, this idea of what he calls the cultural bomb, describes the effect of so-called settlerism or colonial settlerism or colonization that has upon the grips of a people, and how this denial of a people's so-called cultural worldview, right, helps to so-called oppressors or the so-called colonizers to further exploit and oppress the so-called peoples. So the cultural bomb, as he says here, just reading quote, yeah, the effect of a cultural bomb. Again, think of a cultural bomb, yeah, detonation of a people in the way that they think, the way they feel, what they have faith in and believe in, is to annihilate a people's belief. Now, that's a key language, yeah. Annihilate a people's belief. So you got to think what belief means. Yeah. Belief, again, that unspoken sense of you putting your faith into something, in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. Yeah, so again, the cultural bomb, the main purpose, of course, is to destroy within a people the way in which they look at the world. And this is effectuated by, as he says, to lose that kind of faith, yeah, to annihilate the faith in their names. So you think about names in Hawaii, in their languages. Yeah, think about the history of the Hawaiian language. In their environment, think about the changes that occur in a so-called environment, or aina. In their heritage of struggle, the idea of politically struggling, and in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement. And this is not it's not just happens by chance. This is something that's purposely done, like a cultural bomb. Yeah, the purpose many times of these miseducational systems, for example, if you look at what is called education, is to deny a people's sense of understanding of who they are. Yeah, so think about in the history of Hawaii. Yeah, you can look and see even with names, yeah, how names were changed. Many of you may not know that. In fact, it was at one time illegal to have a so-called Hawaiian name, a non-so-called Christian name. And so even your names gets transformed and changed. Think about the language. Why is there a need to erase and eradicate a native people from speaking their language? Yeah. So again, when you think about what he's touching on, this is the cornerstone really for exploitation and control. Yeah, the cornerstones of so-called settler colonialism. Makes me see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement. So you don't even know your history. You don't even know the contributions of your people to this world. Yeah. And to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves, for instance, with other people's languages rather than own. Yeah. So you get taught to believe somehow that learning other languages are more important, are more viable, would be more profitable, perhaps. Yeah, and this kind of creation of what now becomes a self hatred. Yeah, you might not like your skin color, you might not the way you speak, the way you look. Yeah, and the point, of course, is to create despair, despondency, and a collective death wish. But the most key element in this statement, in fact, is the very end, and we'll get into this later on, is when he makes this quote that says that theft is holy, and this is really the main purpose. Yeah, the theft not just of your lands, your resources, your history, and your mind, is seen as being good for you, right? It becomes so called holy, it's sacred. Yes, when you look at the Hawaiian situation, many times it's a mythology, right? Builds up on how lucky that we were that Captain Cook so-called discovered Hawaii. How fortunate we are, in fact, it was the Americans that invaded and took over Hawaii, and not the so-called Japanese. Yeah, so this idea of theft is holy makes you believe, falsely believe, yeah, that you benefited somehow from the so-called takeover. Again, that's part of the mythology. Okay, moving quickly. Yeah. So again, I want you to all times think about what is history? What is the purpose of history? And these are things you can go investigate yourselves, doing a quick Google search and looking around and reading. Again, why is history important? Think about it. What is the difference between so-called history and a political myth? We generally get this quick idea that history is truth, mythology is false ideas, and somehow we're supposed to be able to distinguish it between the two. And in fact, when you study history, it's all about facts. Well, as what we'll quickly find out, how history shapes our minds is to, and many times, make political myths be seen and understood as facts, because there is a purpose behind the telling of that history. And so I want you guys to always remember that. You can hear me sing over and over. There is a purpose to that story. There is a purpose to that mythology. There's a purpose, for example, that tells us why Christopher Columbus, so-called, sailed the ocean blue, and the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and discovered the so-called New World. Yeah, what is the purpose? Who does it benefit? Who does it disempower? And something also to always have in mind: history always empowers and disempowers. I repeat, history, the telling of a story, always empowers somebody, and while disempowering others. Yeah, in there, what is told, and who benefits from the telling of a particular story. The great Malcolm X, he has a very famous quote there: history is a people's memory, and without a memory, man is demoted to the lower animals. That history plays such a huge role in our humanization that when we lack an understanding of our own history, we don't cannot see ourselves in the world as part of humanity. Yeah. So think about what we study, what we learn, whose history is being told for whose humanization. When history is being silenced, or when history is being um, um, malnourished or transformed in a way that is not truthful, right? Again, you got to remember, it's always beneficial to someone else at the expense of those who the history should pertain to. Yes, so there's a reason again for the mythology. So it's incumbent on all humans to understand the history. To know your history is to be human. To be able to carve and tell and store and control your story is your humanity. When others tell your story, then others control your so-called ideas of what your humanity is, right? It's just as a people without roots is dead, a people without history or cultural roots also becomes a dead people. And then going back to the idea of the cultural bomb. Why is it necessary to destroy a people's culture? Right, again, it's a lot easier to so-called control a people if you're able to control their so-called, what defines their humanity. Yeah. So the purposes of history, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you can see on the slide here, a couple of my favorites, starting off on the bottom. History is her story too. Now, what does that mean? Yeah, of course, we should kind of figure out that history, what we call history, has for the most part 99% of all so-called history that has been printed and has been taught in the schools up until recently were written by the male so-called voice. Yeah, a so-called a man's voice versus a woman's. So it's only recently that, in fact, women have been able to give their so-called slant on what is presented as history. Nietzsche, it is precisely facts that do not exist, only interpretation. So again, the power of interpretation. Nothing is ever just illiterate in the sense of what you see is. Yeah, it's always interpreted. Yeah. Alex Haley, history is written by the winners. Yeah, there's a reason why those who take control want to control the narrative, as they say, want to control the history, want to be seen as the heroes. Yeah, want to be seen as the so-called freedom fighters. Want to be seen those who live up to high so-called civilization by telling a story, his story, their story in a way that um, justifies or legitimizes their particular position, especially in the colonial position. And I'm going to end with this last one here because I think, this is really what I'm trying to get at. Going back to my first quotes today. History is past politics, and politics present history. So think about that. Yeah, when we think about politics of today, and this is why we talk about Hawaii, we're going to talk about modern issues, contemporary issues of today. Most of the argument, in fact, has to do with the interpretation of the past. What the intention of a particular law was. Um, what is the so let's look at an example. If we talk about Hawaii and we're going to talk about rights over water, for example, who has rights to water? Well, quickly you're going to start to see there will be in a genealogical form a resuscitation of what water legal history might have been, and in fact into pre so-called legal history, and that somehow that should inform us on traditions or the ways in which water had been monitored, had been distributed, had been so-called controlled, and how what it means for us today. I mean, it's when you think about even in American politics, and if we were here to talk about the gun control, right? Gun control is a huge issue. Even to this day, most of the arguments will be centered on the so-called Second Amendment and the history of the creation of what becomes a Second Amendment. Who said what? What was the intention? What was the purpose of the so-called laws? As if what happened over 200 years ago really should be guiding the way we think today. Again, but that is the power of telling the so-called story. And other images here, and I'm going to just go, of course, just also to mention, you notice the images, the pictures I have here also is for you to also understand that history can be told not just with words, but through film, through music, through the arts, and of course, through the newspapers and many of the graphics. Today, well, social media, yeah, you can kind of see what's going on in the world. Well, old social media were many times drawings, as you can see in the left. They might have been placed into a periodical, a newspaper, a magazine, perhaps. And if you look at the left, you notice at the top left, or need to think about what is that picture of. And for most of you can look, and if you have a little inkling of the story, I use that story, not history, you would recognize, that's John Smith and the story of so-called Pocahontas that's being expressed there. Well, part of the power of images is that many times images have the same kind of power and influence like written words. Yeah, so you would look at this and you can kind of make out the idea of here it looks like a young woman trying to save a man, from the clutches of the so-called savages who look like they're already going to kill him. Now, this particular story is a story. In fact, even to this day, it's kind of presented as if it is somehow true, but in fact, none of this actually occurred historically. But it's presented in this mythological fashion today. Somehow that you have this young so-called Indian woman trying to save the life of John Smith as if he's some kind of great young hero. And the truth was, the horrific things that were performed upon the Native Americans of those areas seems to become justified, right, with the idea of this image that somehow it's the John Smith who's the hero. Yeah, and he's being saved. He obviously must be a good guy. Now, the point I want to say when you look at the story of Pocahontas, you have the Disney version you might see in film. None of that historically occurred. None of that was based on fact. That's all based upon story that is used and displayed as if it is based upon true fact. Now, this is why we went and started off this semester by watching um, uh, those two HBO films, Assume the Position, because it kind of details how stories seem to become manifest in a way to be seen and understood as if they're historical truth and shape the way we think and shape the kind of decisions we'll make when none of it in fact is true. It was made to be true as a film said, yeah, print the legend because it serves a purpose, and that's the main thing to remember. What does this Pocahontas image serve? It serves a particular purpose. Well, let's look at the one below. A little more shocking. You can see evening. Can't see the name of the newspaper, I forget, but you can see in the subheading it says "Kill everyone over 10." Think about it. Kill everyone over 10. Where is that taken from? Well, many times I'll show my students in class, and they'll kind of, by looking at the dress, they can see an American flag. So this has to be the United States. But is it the United States? Is it Americans that are doing the shooting, or is it Americans that are being killed? And actually, if you look carefully and you notice the date, you realize, this has to do, in fact, with the Spanish American War, which was raging in the Philippines at this particular time. And that those are American Marines who have their rifles up, pointing at the backs of, yes, children. As it says, anyone over 10, kill everyone over 10. And this was done by the general. That's his quote. So when you think about history today, yeah, and we look at the horrific ideas of the fact that young boys in this image would be shot in their back blindfolded by Marines would seem horrific, but this is part of a real history. And at one time, it was a history that was glorified even in the United States newspapers. But this happens in the Philippines. The Katipunan movement, which was an anti-colonial movement, first fought against the Spanish and then fought against the United States, who tried to replace the role of the Spanish as a so-called colonizer. And many young Filipinos perished in this particular struggle. But again, this idea, how come many of us today don't read about this? Yeah, don't see the images of American imperialism at that time. That same kind of American imperialism in the Philippines in 1898 is the same kind of American imperialism that ends up in Hawaii. So you think about militarism in Hawaii, it comes in this form also. And again, I just gonna, quickly you can see on the left. Yes, that's the 1930s. That is in Washington D.C., right on the so-called mall, and you can see all these flag waving Americans marching out in the broad daylight and open. America was very much aligned with the so-called Ku Klux Klan. As you can see, they're marching, and unfortunately, the symbolism, especially with the flags, is something we still see even to this day. Maybe they may not have the KKK white robes on, but you can definitely see the same kind of ways in which so-called nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism, is encoded in those images. And the bottom left, in fact, is what's called the My Lai massacre, which happened in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, which kind of really helped to sway the ways in which many Americans, in fact, saw what was going on in Vietnam. These images, which came out about 1972, if I remember right, showcased that the American government, through the U.S. military, through American bombs and weapons, in fact, direct American bombs was dropped on civilian populations like these. And you can see the old women, yes, and children dead on the street from American military operations in Vietnam. And this really helped to sway the so called American public, who quickly turned against any kind of support for the Americans' initiatives in Vietnam due to the fact that it was civilians who were being so called killed. Yes, again, the power images also tell a very different story. Yeah. And up into this picture, most Americans, what they were reading and seeing the news did not showcase, in fact, the ugliness of what was going on in Vietnam at that time. Yeah. And this other quote by Wrong, yeah, the study of history is the playground of patriotism. Think about that. The study of history is the playground of patriotism. And I would have to throw in even religious studies into this point because for many so called white Americans and Christian white Americans, what is considered the so-called Holy Bible, for many of them, is interpreted as being historical. Now, we know for a fact that the so-called Holy Bible is not an historical document, not in the least, but it is believed to by some to be a so-called historical document. Um, Now, and this is, let me just say, mention, we have to understand there's a difference between faith, yeah, faith and fact. Yeah. Fact is based upon evidence. I gather evidence, and from the evidence, I will come to a certain kind of idea. Now, as the evidence changes, so will the ideas change, right? The evidence changes, ideas change. Now, faith is based upon the idea that I will have belief in something even when there are no facts or evidence to support it, or even, you're going to use it worse, is that even when the facts speak out against the belief, yeah, they still will hold on to a faith and belief as if it is evidence and fact. And see, this is what we got to understand. It's not just that things are fact or evidence based, but also to understand that for some humans, for many people, especially religious doctrine, it's not about facts, right? It doesn't matter what the facts say. Their belief is based upon some faith or belief on some kind of interpretation, usually some political mythology that they have interpreted to be based on facts. Yeah. I also like this one by David McCullough in the middle. History is who we are. Think about it. History is who we are and why we are the way we are. Okay. So, what are historical myths? Yeah, traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of a worldview of a people. There's a service, there's a purpose. Yeah. Um, and at the bottom, a culture's myths are usually closely related to its religious beliefs and rituals. Political myths also an ideologically marked narrative. It's a story which purports, again, purports, it doesn't mean it is, it purports to give a true account. Yeah, it's a good story. There's ideas, ideologically narrated, and there's ideas that line up within the story to present a particular worldview, to give a true account, right? It gives you the impression that it's the truth of a set of past, present, and predicted political events, which is accepted as valid. So I guess the point. It doesn't mean that, in fact, they have been proven to be valid, but they're just accepted to be valid, yeah, by a particular social group, yeah, by an entity. Yeah. Political myths are narratives through which we orient ourselves and act and feel about our political world. Again, so the mythologies, yeah, will shape the direction or the so-called trajectory of a so-called people. A political myth is an interpretation, again, interpretation of what the myth maker, rightly or wrongly, takes to be hard fact. But by the fact that it is believed to be true, again, that's that point. Again, going back to the idea of believed to be true versus what is true. What marks a myth as being political is its subject matter. Political myths deal with politics. Yeah, so and even though myths you may not see as being politically initially, when you look into their context, why, what they do, what they service, then you start to understand there's a purpose why that myth is maintained as if it's based on fact and truth. The great John Henrik Clarke, one of my favorite historians, an African historian, as he says here, powerful people cannot afford to educate the people that they oppress. Because once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power, you will take it. Yeah, so again, who gets to educate? Who gets to control the information? Who gets to determine what it is to be educated? Yeah, is determined by those who hold power. Yeah, and for those who are powerless, yeah, it's very clear. You cannot depend on those who are in power to really educate you about your particular situation. In fact, you should expect that these political mythologies will be pushed as a means for you to not seek power. See, once you are educated, you will not allow others, right, to oppress you. Yeah, but if I can condition you in a way, bamboozle your mind way to accept somehow your situation in life, or to teach you, in fact, you deserve where you are, and I deserve to be the ruler, right? You have already been conditioned to accept that. And if you create a system by which it becomes normalized or naturalized as if it's true, you see, then it's very, very difficult, in fact, because what is presented as truth is really what binds the thinking of those who are oppressed by that so-called interpretation of what is presented to be true. So let's kind of start off here. I'm going to, real quickly, one of the first mythologies I just wanted to take a look at, of course. And you might say, why am I choosing this? Because when you think about world history, probably the greatest um, creation by humanity, in fact, probably are the so-called what's called the Great Pyramids of Giza in today what's called Egypt. Yeah, that even scientifically, mathematically, um, as an engineering feat, yeah, it's incredible to think that these were built, and in fact, even to this day, the mythology of how they were built. Yeah, and you got to think, why is it important? Well, if your people, your history built the pyramids, obviously that means that you come from a very high civilized people. And so let's look at these images here. Yeah, who built the Great Pyramids? Well, as you can see in the Hollywood versions from the Ten Commandments, we have on the top left that is played by Charlton Heston. That's Moses. He represents Moses, and Ramses by Yul Brynner. And at the top right, you notice there is Moses to the left and Yul Brynner in the middle. And this is the Pharaoh Seti, who said here. Now, I want to take a good look at these images here. Yeah. So when you think of ask the question, who built the Great Pyramids? Hollywood gives us a particular story. But how accurate is this narrative? So think about yourselves. Who built the Great Pyramids? Why does it matter? See, why does it matter? And if it doesn't matter, why not tell the so-called truth based upon facts and evidence? Well, the images of the Great Pyramids of Giza, you know, stood as the highest, tallest human-made structures for 5,000 years. There's so many genius level attributes of the Great Pyramids. It's almost impossible to explain. But we know that these pyramids represent the highest level of science, mathematics, and so-called civilization. And we come to this image here. Well, I want you guys to look at this image here. I'm sure some of you, if you travel to Las Vegas, would have seen this in front of the Luxor. But why would I have this image here? What's the issue? Take a good look at this issue. Why is it presented in this way? Look at the face, look at the nose, look at the eyes. Why is this presented in Las Vegas? Is this based upon truth and fact? And if not, why not? And if it is, what is the evidence? Well, let's look at what you'll find out there. Today, the land that the pyramids sit on is called Egypt. Now, that's a Greek name, so that's not the original name. The original name of this land was Kemet, ancient Kemet, depending on the spelling, KMT, sometimes KEMET. But the Kemet culture, in fact, the original indigenous culture of what today we call Egypt, in fact, the word Kemet means the black lands. As you can see in these images here, what's the difference? Why is this in Las Vegas and not this? Even National Geographic. In fact, if you were to look at the images, at the actual images, the artwork that's there, these are the kinds of images that you will see without a doubt. As you can see, look at this pharaoh. I mean, looks more like Michael Jackson, and and as you can see, yeah, they were very much people of color in different shades and hues. But it's no doubt that they were not so-called European, Caucasian, so-called white people who built those pyramids. And yes, what is the evidence? Well, people forget. What we call Egypt today is in Africa. It's right there, right at the top of the African continent. Now, think about this. I'm sure if you think about the lands of Sudan today, think about Sudan. Sudan is next door to Egypt. Next to Sudan is Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Uganda. all of these countries here are pretty much filled with what you would think as being dark African units. So, going to continue on with this on lecture number 2 coming up. Aloha.